Thank you for joining us. I am here today with Robert Charles, author of Cherish America. If it's okay, I think I'll be calling you Bobby. Does that work for you?
That is perfect, Melissa.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. I'm going to start really easy. I know it was in your very illustrious career, it was a smaller portion, but since you are talking to us here at the Reagan Library, I thought I would just start by asking you to share with our audience what you did during Ronald Reagan's administration.
I was, Melissa, in his White House during the years 1981, 82, and 83. And although I was there off and on, more in the summers and off terms from Oxford and other things, the reality was I was what they call a temporary employee. I was a very low level person that did nothing of any consequence, but I was part of the Office of Policy Development, which was a domestically focused group. And I have to tell you that in many ways, what we do at the ages of 21, 22, 25 are in some ways more influential or more formative in our lives than things we do at the age of 50, 60, whatever. And so it had a tremendous effect on me just to be around Ronald Reagan, to be in all the Rose Garden ceremonies, I think I wrote one memo that got to him, which was about poverty in America. But I worked with people, of course, who were always with him, and they were very inclusive. And, this is part of our job, is to be a mentor. We didn't have that word back then, but to be a mentor and to bring people along and say, gosh, I want you to come see the president. I want you to be in this room and just be there. So my eyes were big as saucers. I was completely absorbed in what I was seeing. And as the years progressed, I always knew I was working in a White House, and I felt very privileged coming out of rural Maine that I could do that. But only later did I realize you worked for one of the epic leaders in the history of our country. And no kidding, this is a man who fundamentally changed America and the world for the better, an incredible, inveterate optimist. And of course, years later, I worked with Colin Powell, and I came to the conclusion that Colin Powell himself learned an incredible amount. I saw it reflected back into his day-to-day operations from Ronald Reagan. So the truth is, Ronald Reagan was and will always be a force that represents an example of how to do the best, be resilient, and somehow figure out how, to borrow his words, which of course he borrowed from Lincoln's first inaugural, how to listen to the better angels of our nature and be our best selves.
Well, that leads to so many other questions, but the next one I wanted to ask you, which in a sense perhaps you've already answered, but whenever we have the opportunity to meet someone and speak with someone who worked with Ronald Reagan in any capacity, we love to ask them if they have a story or a behind-the-scenes moment that really gets at the character of President Reagan, not his policy, not any of that, but sort of, who he was as a man. And I wonder if you were around him enough to maybe have one of those stories?
I do have several, but I'll maybe one or two that I'll tell you that to me. So, in writing this book, Cherish America, and of course, its subtitle is Stories of Courage, Character, and Kindness. What I was trying to do is elevate what amounts to real leadership at the national level, where I saw it with people like Ronald Reagan, but also at the personal level, where we're doing the right thing and we're doing it instinctively because somehow the combination of training and conscience pull us there. I will tell you that. At least two stories I'll tell you. One is I just because they come to my mind. Again, remember, I was no one important. I was just someone there, which in some ways makes me interesting because I was an observer I was a tabula rasa. I was just a kid that came out of rural Maine looking at the president of the United States and trying to understand what I was seeing. And so, first of all, kindness. Let me just talk about kindness for a minute. Ronald Reagan, many instances, but one that sticks in my mind was we were out in the Rose Garden, and ironically, we're in a moment in American history again where we're trying to make our government efficient. And Ronald Reagan was very determined to make our government efficient. Even in that era, I knew that was happening. And in 1982, I think he appointed the Grace Commission, and they really went after the idea of making things efficient. Part of that was that he commissioned his cabinet secretaries to go find and agency heads to find money that could be saved in a probably a less dramatic fashion than we're doing today, but just get out there and get that money saved so that we're doing. I mean, he'd spent his entire life talking about trying to keep government limited and accountable. So one day we're in the Rose Garden, and the head of USAID, coincidentally, it was the US head of AID, had one of these gigantic cardboard checks. I mean, huge, this gigantic thing that was $25 million that he had saved, and he was presenting it in the Rose Garden in a kind of a press conference back to the president to show we've saved this amount of money in the fiscal year. So in that moment, and the Rose Garden's a relatively quiet. I mean, it's a small place. People think it must be grand, and it's nothing like the lawn of the Capitol or anything like that. It's very small, and there are roses behind you. So if you imagine that I right now am standing in the Rose Garden, behind me would be the press room where those books are. In front of me, looking out onto the mall, would be the Washington Monument. And so between where I am now and sort of where the listener is, imagine that there's a group of reporters and they're all looking this way at the president. And among them is Sam Donaldson, who was a not particularly friendly fellow. Ronald Reagan somehow got a rapport with him because he got a rapport with everyone. But he wasn't a Helen Thomas type. He was a very sort of rough-edged fellow. So the check gets handed back to the president. We're here in the Rose Garden, and Sam Donaldson, from more or less where people are there, grabs his cameraman, drags him right by the president into the press room, which would be behind me, and disappears. And never fazed the president. He finished up, and Ed Meese was with him, and I think Jim Baker, and they sort of gently urged him to go over this way back to the Oval Office, and you'd go into the Oval Office, which was right on the Rose Garden through these double doors. And as he's going back, he looked down into the grass and he picked something up. Now I'm just a young kid. This is all pre 9/11. You can follow the president. You can see what is he doing. And so he picks up something from the grass and goes back here into the press room, which is a gaggle of people, and he wanders back until he finds the cameraman for Sam Donaldson, not a particularly nice fellow, and says to him, "You dropped your lens cap." Now, I thought to myself, the press will never cover that. But here is a kind act by a man who is the president of the United States, and he's just doing a kind act. Um, another when I went out and visited him later and spent time one on one with him in California in Century City, and another little story is he was man of such good cheer right to the end. I mean, he was very crisp when I visited him in maybe 91 or two, but he had such a as time passes, your true nature never departs you. And if your true nature is a good and kind nature, it's always there. So later in life, I think it still was with him. But on this particular occasion, I visited him out there, and I'll never forget when I signed in, something funny about hearing Ronald Reagan in Ronald Reagan's voice say, "Okay, now let's see, who's mine? Robert Charles." And I thought to myself, gosh, the president is mentioning my name. Just so I walked around the corner. We sat down for about 20 minutes, half an hour, and we talked about everything. But one of the stories he told, which I found fascinating, and I thanked him. My real reason for being there was not to be there, but to thank him for bringing down the Soviet Union, which was a tremendously important thing in our moment and remains important to this day, of course. So one of the things that happens, of course, is that you run out of things to say. And so I was pointing to a picture on the wall, actually, and this story relates to the eminent good humor and humility that always attached to Reagan. I point to this picture, and we talked about a number of the pictures, and he was very excited that the pictures behind him, by the way, on the desk behind him, were all his family. He had one picture of Dwight Eisenhower, actually, behind him, which the writing had faded a little into red on. But he was also very excited that all of his friends had gotten together and created the library there in Simi Valley, and that he had it created with private money. And he asked me immediately, have you gone there yet? And of course, I was embarrassed because I hadn't gone there yet. And I said, I will get there, which of course I did many times. But he said, when we put it together, and the other presidents came and saw it, and he was very quiet about things. He said, it really Well, a lot of people thought that it was a perfect replica of the Oval Office, and it really was a beautiful place. So I point to a picture on the wall, and it's a picture with he and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. And I said, I know you had a great relationship with her. How did that develop? And he said, well, he told several stories about Thatcher and about Nancy Reagan and he going and visiting the Queen Mother, who they loved, and others. And but finally he said, well, and he told me what's the group of seven. He said, so when I was first in the office of president, he said, I went over and we had a big event and it was a group of seven meeting. And he said, these are the industrialized countries. And I said, yeah, yeah. And he said, well, I walked into a large room and Maggie, he didn't call her Prime Minister Thatcher, he called her Maggie. He said, Maggie was sitting in a chair in the corner of the room. And Pierre Trudeau, of course, the father of the current Trudeau, she said, was leaning over him and leaning over Margaret Thatcher, Maggie, and lecturing her. And he said, I watched, and he was saying, your conservative policies will never work. It's just a complete disaster what you're doing in Great Britain, and blah, 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 blah. And so the Canadian Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau, eventually wandered away. And he said, I went over to Maggie and I said, and she got up from her chair and she wandered down a hall and I caught up with her and I said, Maggie, he had no right to say those things to you. Those things were just really out of line. Why did you let him get away with that? And Ronald Reagan said, as he's talking to me, he said, she looked at me and she said, Ron, a woman must know when a man is being simply childish. And he laughed out loud. He thought it was the funniest thing in the world because it sort of fit perfectly the situation. But he was also very kind in that conversation, and he spent time talking to me, who was a low level guy that really had nothing to do with anything, but he was gracious and kind. And when we were leaving, I said to him, I after I eventually I sort of felt I didn't want to overstay my welcome, and so I collected myself and I was on my way back out, and I said thank you to him again, shook his hand, and I was standing at the door. I didn't really know what else to say to this hero of mine, and I said to him, sir, because it was true. I said, you just look so physically fit. You look fit as a fiddle, and he smiled and looked at me and said, well, as a young man, I did play football. Like that explained everything. But there were many instances like that where he cared about the little people, right? I was just the little people, and he cared about everybody. Toward the end, I'll give you one other story that many people may or may not appreciate, but even toward the end, when he would come into the office and apparently, there were some memory issues. One day, a good friend of mine was a staff member with him, and this goes to the heart of a good man's nature never changes. Um, he was waiting at the elevator at the bottom his floor was his office was up fairly high in this Century City building, and so they would take an elevator up, and he was waiting at the elevator door. And again, this is quite advanced in his beautiful letter of the long goodbye to America and Alzheimer's coming on, and he was standing by the elevator, and this a staff member explained it to me. She said it was the most beautiful thing. The elevator door opened and he could easily have just stepped in and gone on his way, but he noticed coming through the door was a young woman who was obviously also headed to the elevator. And so he stopped and he held the elevator door and he said, "Please, after me." And she said, "Where did that come from? That other things were becoming a big challenge for him, but this gracious good nature never changed." And to me, I guess it's a testament. Ronald Reagan was truly as important to America as many of the founding fathers. And what he did for us was to model this idea. Another staffer used this word. She said, I've worked for him for 8 years, and I've always wondered and hoped I wouldn't, but wondered if I would hear something out of the side of his mouth that I didn't want to hear. She said, no, he is truly guileless. And she said, how many people could become the president of the United States with no guile? Powerful thing. So that is the model we want for our governors. It's what we want for our teachers, for our parents, for our local leaders, for our civic leaders, and of course for our presidents. We want people that we can look up to because they are not just great, but good.
I love that, and thank you for sharing those stories. I promise I have a ton of questions about the other sections of your book. I have one more Reagan question before we move on.
Yeah.
You also have a beautiful chapter on Nancy Reagan, and I wondered if you could maybe share just a little bit of your time with her and the impression that she left with you.
Nancy Reagan is one of those people that historiographers over time will come to love. But like Eisenhower, like some of our other founding fathers, and Abigail Adams, for example, and Edith Roosevelt, there are often times when history gets it wrong. They do a first draft of someone, and then they change it, and they do another draft of someone, and then they do another. And what happens? It's kind of like the aging of a good wine. Over time it finds its place, and it's either a good wine or it's not. And the situation with Nancy Reagan, who I did get to know quite well and stayed up with almost to the end, is that Nancy Reagan was a deeply, deeply caring person. She cared deeply about children, all the way back to caring about foster parents and children. Both she and President Reagan, of course, were not. They truly thought abortion was a terrible thing because it takes the life of a child. They were just people who listened to their conscience. And of course, what did she do as a good wife? She and mother, she cared about her children. She cared about her husband. And so oftentimes in politics, if a first lady at any level cares deeply about their husband, they get in the way of some of the policy people that want to just trot their husband around the world, and or wife, I guess, and but do any get them. They don't. Very often a policy person doesn't care about the person the way a family member will. Well, Nancy Reagan was as good a human being in her ability to take care of her husband as she was in her caring for children. And of course, I worked with her later in drug prevention and trying very hard to remind people. And goodness knows she was not only ahead of the curve then, but her voice is as resonant today on this issue as it ever was in the 1980s or 1990s. She foresaw that our entire society could be deeply and adversely affected if we didn't educate our kids to understand what to stay away from, as well as inspire them to the American dream. So her husband spent a lot of time inspiring them to the American dream. And she also spent time saying, we need to remind you to make good choices uh, in your youth and throughout the rest of your life when it comes to things like drug abuse. And so I worked with her later, in particular, brought her to Washington. She very graciously, I asked her, would she come to Washington to talk one more time before the Alzheimer's issue became a central piece of her thinking? Would she come and please testify in front of Congress and talk to the American people? And I later wrote a book, and she wrote an introduction to it, but about how important this is, that parents and teachers and civic leaders and members of Congress and all of us protect the children and remember how important they are to the future of our country. And so, remarkably, she came to Washington, and I had a couple of congressmen with me, and I said, and I had known her for before, and of course Joanne Drake came, and Lisa Cavalier came, and it was all a beautiful thing, and so before that next day when she was going to testify, and she did a splendid job, front page of the Washington Post, and just a beautiful job reminding us of who our better angels are. That day before, we went down, and the Secret Service let us come up and meet with her. And I say this because historians don't know how truly a person of heart she was. They think of her as someone who made big decisions to protect her husband. And of course, good for her for doing that. But she was a person of enormous good heart in her own right, and a leader in her own right. And so this day we come up to her hotel room area, and I'm thinking it'll be like everything else in Washington. It'll be a fancy polished table, and we'll sit at the table and we'll listen to what she is going to do the next day, and we'll give her kind of a pre-brief on. We kept the press as much as we could to a distance and let members of Congress and others talk with her. But no, this wasn't at all what happened. We go to the door, and the Secret Service let us in. And to be quite honest, and it's kind of a speaking out of school thing, Nancy Reagan, elegant as she was in a terry cloth robe, and she sat down on her couch and pulled her legs up under her like a school child, like a little girl. And she said, "So, what I want to really convey is this, and this is why I'm here." And it was like talking to your mother or your grandmother about why these moral issues really do matter. And you're listening and you're thinking, no, there's no pretense to any of this. This is sincere heart talking about what matters to her. Otherwise, why would she have come to Washington? There was nothing, she didn't have to be there. She didn't have to subject herself one more time to the press. And so we walked out, I think, almost in awe of her because she was such an elegant person when on the world stage, but such a humble person when it came to something like protecting children or protecting her husband. So she was an amazing lady.
Well, thank you for that. We're going to get into the rest of your book now. You know, for those who have not read it, you tell amazing stories about incredible people. You are a very gifted writer. It's the book reads very quickly. And reading the book made me realize, like, you know, a lot of really amazing people with really amazing life stories. And it made me wonder, and maybe not a fair question to ask you, but you know, if maybe we all just put our phones down for a moment and got to know our neighbors, do you think maybe we all maybe know could potentially find that we know more people than we think we know that have these stories that are worth hearing?
Melissa, it's a 100% yes on that. The people you pass in a grocery store, the people that we in our hurly burly life that we don't spend time to get their stories from are often truly heroic people. And in fact, I dare say we have a hero in all of us, and that there are stories in our own past, all of us, that we either have put in a place where they're kind of on an upper shelf and we don't take them down and talk about them. We might talk about them to a child or a grandchild, but we don't really dwell on them. And part of what I had to do, honestly, in this book, many of the 56 stories are about people that no one in the world knows except me, or very few people know, but they are true heroes. They did something that was unbelievably courageous, and I honestly, some of them I didn't learn until I'd known these people for decades, and then just one day it slips out, and I said, "So tell me about that. Tell me how that worked. What happened?" And some of the people, a couple in this book, actually were willing to tell the full story, but don't bother using my last name. And you
Mm.
say, "Wow, yeah, okay. I mean, I get it. I'll tell you another little piece of this book, and when I tell you a couple of the stories, your listeners and our viewers will understand this. I did not write this book as a testament to faith. There have been books written about Ronald Reagan and his faith, and particularly after the assassination attempt, how he felt about his time on Earth, and how he owed it to do good for God. But that was not the purpose of my writing this book on any of these stories. And yet all of these people, virtually to a one, who did these heroic things somewhere in the hours and hours of interviews, I would say it's an amazing thing that you did. And they would say, wasn't just me. So a few stories. First story in the book, a law enforcement guy that worked for me. And he was very young, and it's written in a more poetic or Agatha Christie style way of thinking about what happened. But he was on his way home from work. He worked the night shift. He was a law enforcement officer who wanted to go after felons downtown in the city he was working in, and he was headed home. And this goes to how law enforcement officers are trained, and how many of them are people of incredible good heart that we don't give them credit for because we don't listen. They don't tell the stories again. Heroes don't tend to retell their own stories unless you really draw them out. So I did with him, and he was headed home one early morning. It had just become dawn, and he passed a trailer park with he thought he saw smoke curling out of a trailer. And he knew, as a law enforcement officer, a trailer goes up like a boom. It just doesn't, a trailer, when it catches fire, everything goes. So he literally pulled his car up onto the lawn of this trailer, just on instinct. He was exhausted. He told me I didn't have any coffee with me either. He said I was just tired. But he pulled up on this lawn and he ran in and well, he ran to the door. He said if the door hadn't been unlocked, I don't know. Door was unlocked. Immediately, billowing smoke. He fell to the ground, looked across with like 6 inches of non-smoke at the bottom, and saw a crib. And so he crawled across, reached around inside until he found a pair of legs, and was headed out the door. And on the couch beside, he saw another pair of legs, the little legs off the couch. And so he grabbed those. He got literally to the door frame, got out the door, and the whole place exploded behind him, singed up the back of his head. And I said, his name is Rick. I said, Rick, that's unbelievable. What happened? He goes, well, I was a little burned, but the kids were fine. I said, what did you do? He said, well, I took them outside. I put them down and waited till the fire department got there and made sure they were taken care of. And then I went home. I said, so did you file a report? Did you talk to the television reporters? Did you? He said, no, I didn't need to do that. I said, what else did you do? He said, well, I slept well that night. I said, you never even, no need for media or social media. And of course, there wasn't any social media. No need for any of this stuff. He said, Bobby, a beautiful thing happened. God put me in a place that I needed to be in order to save 2 lives. What more did I need? Next story in that book is about a teacher, World War II teacher. Actually, the next one's about a Vietnam War veteran who was my history teacher. And there are a lot of beautiful things in that story. His name's Dave Cook. Volunteered, by the way, to go to Vietnam. Did not get drafted. Had always wanted to be a history teacher when he was young. And lo and behold, when that war broke out, he said, as many young men did, this is my war. World War II veterans had grown them up. This is something where my nation needs me. So I'm going to step out and go be a part of it. And so he did a lot of heroic things in the war, and I'll leave those for readers. But one of the most remarkable things he did is when he came home, the 101st Airborne, he was a paratrooper, infantry, was out in the jungle all the time. When he got home, there was no internet. And so there was no way for all these thousands of Vietnam vets who came home to communicate with each other. And so what he did is he started a giant nationwide newsletter in which he would collect stories from people, kind of the way this book collects them, but he did it on a massive scale. And he would allow people to share experiences, which at that time, I mean, I don't even think we used the words PTSD back then. At that time, it was very important for people to share their stories. So this one of the stories that sticks with me, which is in the book, is one day I said, tell me something that happened as a result of these stories that people would tell you. He said, well, one day somebody called me and I picked up the phone and he said, you're Dave Cook? He said, yes. He said, I'm looking for someone named Jack. And Dave said, Jack who? He said, I don't know. And then he told this story. In the middle of a terrible firefight in Vietnam, in a very specific location, which Dave detailed, there is a guy running across an open field and he stumbles on a medic. And the medic he's got 4 guys laid out in front of him, but he's working on 3 of them. And one of them is over here. He's not working on him at all. And the fellow that stumbled on the medic said, what about the 4th guy over here? And he said, the medic said, I might be able to save these 3, but that guy's bled out. He's white. He's gone. There's no veins. I can't put anything in him. I got to work on the people I can save. And so the guy that stumbled on the medic and the 4 men said he recognized the 4th guy. They'd been drinking beers in a Vietnamese place, 2 weeks earlier. And so he said to the medic, well, what if I found a vein? He said, if you find a vein, I'll put plasma in him. And he checked here and everywhere you check for veins, no veins. And he finally found a vein, as Dave Cook told me, in his ankle. And as Dave said, he put some plasma in him, got him going, and that was that. 40 years later, the guy that had been saved was calling my teacher and said, I only know that the guy that saved me's name was Jack. I have to find him. And he put them together. My eighth grade math teacher, another story in this book, serendipitous. And you're absolutely right, Melissa. We all have heroes at our elbow. They're all out there. You just have to ask questions. You have to be interested in people. You have to love your neighbor enough to ask them a little bit about themselves. And you will be rewarded by learning more than you ever believed. Years after I'd had my eighth grade math teacher, Ron Herrick, and people can look him up online, his wife Cynthia and I stumbled on something, and I called them and said, "What is this? Is this really what happened?" And she said, "Oh yes, that's what happened." So Korean War vet, he, Ron Herrick, and his brother Richard were Korean War soldiers. They came back. Their mother and father had died while they were away. So when they got back, they only had the two of them. That's all they had. And Richard, a couple of years after getting back, got a fatal disease, a rare disease that afflicted his kidneys, nephrology, and both of his kidneys were dying. And as the doctors said at Brigham and Women's in Boston, there's no cure. So he had maybe 6 weeks to live. So this is the mid 1950s. My math teacher Ron said, "Why does it happen in medicine that, I mean, as a matter of biology, that I can have two kidneys that are both fine. I only need one, but my brother's going to have none, and I can't give him one of mine." And the doctor, Dr. Murray, said, "Never been done before. We don't do that. We don't put a human organ in another person. And there are religious reasons we don't. And we just have never done that before. So we're not going to do that." And that night, Cynthia and he said, the doctor called him at home and said, "I've been thinking about this. And if it would ever work, it would be with identical twins." Short story, they did 17 tests to see if one piece of skin would attach to another. They took Ron's skin, put it on Richard's. Only one of those tests worked. But they did it. And the bottom line is Ron, my eighth grade math teacher, first person in history to have an organ transplant to a relative, his brother. Brother got married, had two kids, lived a good life. Ron himself lived a long life. And last year, there were 40,000 transplants.
Yeah, that is incredible.
Uh, Wonderful
Yeah,
people. Courage.
and your book is chapter after chapter after chapter of these incredible stories. Now, for again, someone who hasn't read the book yet, not every chapter is on someone you know. And so my next question is actually on that. Randomly, I was reading your book on an airplane on the way to a work trip last month. And the work trip was I had the privilege and honor of going to Auschwitz for the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the camp. And I'm literally reading your book and get to the chapter. You have a chapter on the liberation of Auschwitz. And so I thought that was fitting and interesting. But my question, I guess, is why did you want to include a chapter on that time in our history?
So there are four, and many of these things do relate back, ironically, to the period of time during which Ronald Reagan lived and also led. So many of those stories come from the 1980s, a period of time during which I had worked for him. So there are really four sections in the book. The first section is people you've never heard of that have done heroic, beautiful, inspiring things. You read one of these stories in a night, you'll be happy. The second is about places. The third is about special people that I interacted with, including people like Buzz Aldrin for 25 years. I still talk to Buzz 3 times a week, and some of the other Apollo astronauts. And then the fourth is more about founding fathers and heroic people that are of a different nature. So that section you're talking about is a second section, and I believe that's the second or third story in that second section. It was places in time that I think reflect an enormous influence of America, because this book is about cherishing America and idealism and faith. And one of the points I was going to make earlier, and I probably didn't make it as clearly as I meant to, is that almost every single story in here accidentally ends up coming back in some way to the goodness of mankind, but also of conscience and of faith. And so the reason Auschwitz is there, the first story I think in that section is actually ironically about walking through Arlington, where I have about 20 family members, including my father and my grandfather, and um, and having a shaft of light illuminate, and the picture's right there in the book. As I walked toward a stone, I asked myself, I wonder if it's my great uncle. I wonder, World War II. I wonder if there's any chance that he could actually see me doing this and visiting his stone. And I'm telling you, it gives me shivers. A shaft of light hit that stone, and the picture's right there in the book.
The picture is
Well,
incredible.
it's unbelievable. And I just happen to have my phone, the phone we're talking on right now. I happen to have my phone with me, and I thought, no one will ever believe this. And then I thought, no, I have my phone here. I'll take a picture of it. Next story is about Normandy, and I or one of them shortly after that with President Reagan, of course, speaking at Normandy. He spoke shortly after I'd been there. I went there, really walked those beaches alone, and another story in the book is that one of my teachers who was on Omaha Beach day one, promoted to captain on the beach. But I walked that beach because it's historically a place where America began the process of saving the world. And on that particular day, 6,000 Americans died on that beach. And by the time we got to Paris on August 23rd, that was June 6th, 1944. By the time we got to Paris, we had 60,000 casualties. And we did that to save the world, and we did. Auschwitz is an example, and I encourage people to see series like Band of Brothers, where Ambrose and Tom Hanks, and you understand because it's a dramatization of the reality of what happened. Auschwitz and Birkenau and Dachau, these camps, and because you've been there, these camps are they bring you to a kind of silence that goes so deep in your heart that it almost makes your heart stop because you cannot imagine that evil could have taken this turn. And I, again, was by myself. I walked down those tracks. I walked through the gas chambers. Um, it's hard for me to put into words. I guess it took me a long time to write that particular story because I felt if you have not experienced this, and most people will never walk through Auschwitz, you must understand not only the potential for evil and evil to recur again, but the importance of stepping up as a moral people, which the Americans did and the Europeans did, and stopping evil. Edmund Burke was right that all it takes for evil to prevail is for good people to do nothing. And so part of this book is also to inspire people every single story. And I go back and I tear up reading some of them myself because I ask myself, and I would encourage people to ask themselves as they read the book. In fact, you don't even have to remember it, it'll happen to you. You say to yourself, if I was in that situation, what would I have done? Would I have risked my life? Would I have potentially lost my life in order to do the right thing and stop something from happening? And so all of these stories are like that. But that one was particularly moving because I had also spent some time behind the Iron Curtain at that time. That's where it was. I was in Poland, but I had also been working actually quietly with Solidarity, and and it really shocked me to my core to walk through Auschwitz. And it's the first time, again, growing up in rural Maine, it's the first time I ever imagined that there were forces at work that were truly so powerful that you really had to step up on just pure instinct and stop them. And we are. I'll say. I think we're in a spiritual. The spiritual environment is very much around us, and we're in a spiritual war to keep good from ever being subsumed in evil. Einstein himself, I think, is the one who said, "Only those that can see the invisible can do the impossible." And most much of what is important in life, which Reagan fully understood, and so did his wife, um, is not what we see here with our eyes. It's what we don't see.
Hmm.
And that ranges from love to goodness to power to, you know, listening to your better angels.
I love that. I actually had a question that you just sort of talked about, but I want to go back to it. As you're talking about the chapters in that section, you talked about visiting your uncle at Arlington National Cemetery, and I actually want to read a quote. So as I look down in that chapter, you wrote, "If every child in America and perhaps adults who miss the chance or who savor peace as I do walked a military cemetery once a year, our country would be different." I found that so powerful. Can you explain what you meant by that?
America, Melissa, is not an accident. America, and I pray that our children, and perhaps in coming years, the rest of us who have just as easy a chance to forget as anyone else, remember that all that we have around us, everything that we're looking at here, is a product of sacrifice. And in particular, veterans who lie in cemeteries all over the world and in this country did what they did in order to give their families and ultimately the rest of us a chance to live in freedom. And so, Colin Powell used to say, and I'm sure he learned it in a day-to-day actions, including with the president, President Reagan, uh, we we have to be equal to our time. And how do we teach our children and our grandchildren to be equal to our time? We have to bring to them for a moment a level of sobriety, solemnity, basic, simple understanding that where they are in life is actually not a product entirely of their own hard work, although hard work is good and important. It is a product of all those people who worked hard and many of them died for them. Those people in those cemeteries, Arlington, died for you and for me and for them. And I think it changes someone, just like a brush with death changes someone. Um, it changes you if you walk, particularly maybe with a veteran, through a cemetery and let them explain to you the bond that existed between them and the people in their platoon or the people in their that they were willing to die for each other. And because they were willing to do that, it really wasn't the extension of that is they were willing to die for you. And so everything you have in your schoolroom, all those opportunities that you love, having some sports to go to, a television to watch, all the social media, all of that is a product of these people who who put their lives on the line, and many of them lost their lives. Again, just think of Normandy, 6,000 dead on one day to restore freedom to Europe and to the world. So I feel that we miss the opportunity, Melissa, many times to do something very obvious, very simple, that will actually dramatically affect another person's understanding. Part of that is showing, part of it is talking, part of it is writing, part of it is illustrating, part of it is just being quiet and allowing someone to ask you questions. Maybe children, I think they should be encouraged to be curious and ask questions. And and what we have this great treasure trove in older people. I don't consider myself older people, but we have this great treasure trove in older people who have had life experiences that are so valuable, and they're willing, many of them, to transfer them to us if we'll just ask. I wrote another book before this one called Eagles and Evergreens, and I went and talked with veterans in veterans homes, many of them World War II veterans. And, what they told me changed me. It changed me. Just to listen to what they said and to watch them tear up out of the remembrance of, well, close brushes with death and loss of friends. And so part of it is just to help us understand that none of us get anywhere in life by ourselves. None of us. Nobody. Not Ronald Reagan, not you, not me, not anybody watching. And you have to be appreciative. You have to be grateful. You have to understand with humility that it is upon your shoulders to carry the burden forward of being equal to your time. And Ronald Reagan was a very humble man. Really, people don't. They think, oh, President of the United States, movie actor, he must have not been. No, he was a very humble man, and that's because I think he never forgot. He had come out of a family with an alcoholic father, a deeply loving mother. He learned forgiveness at an early age in life. He also learned how to take care of other people. The philosophers talk about other regarding people, people who live their lives focused on service, mission, and helping others. And that could be nurses, like the nurse in the book. It could be presidents. It could be fighter pilots. One of the stories in the book is my good friend Jeff Cashman, who was one of the two armed fighter pilots, F-16 pilots on 9/11. He didn't get there, but talking with him later, we have ways of helping other people that are grand and simple. And we just have to remember that, the greatest part of our life is those little moments where we do the right thing and we help others. And I feel as though the people that did the extraordinary thing die for us. We need to remember them. We need to go out and teach, honestly, consciously teach, like people in Maine. That Maine is this where the Wreaths Across America comes from, and it's a family that started a process that originally was just putting wreaths on grave sites at Arlington at Christmas. Now they're all over the United States, and young people participate in that. So we have to educate because, as Ronald Reagan said, the love of freedom does not get passed down through the blood. It gets passed down by educating.
Thank you for that. So beautifully said, and I agree with you completely. You've mentioned a few times about working with Colin Powell. You have a handful of chapters on him. For those who haven't read the book or don't know, you went on in life to actually become his Assistant Secretary of State. I've never met him, and so reading a few of your chapters, there are so many character traits of Colin Powell that are so much like Ronald Reagan, and you even talk about that. And so my actual question is, I was curious, you talked about it being the highlight of your career, being able to work for him. What's the number one lesson you learned from your time with Colin Powell?
Take care of people.
Mm.
If you take care of people, they will take care of you. You take care of your people, they'll take care of you. And he illustrated that again and again. And he did it without ever, not once saying the words I just really said, maybe once, but really almost never. One of the stories I think I have in there is my daughter, when she was about 3 or 4, I was serving, and one day, one day we're headed to an apple orchard because we would do that as a family, go pick apples in the fall. And out of the back seat comes this, I want to pick apples for Colin Powell. And I looked at my life like, where in the world, like all these other things kids say that come from where in the world, where in the world did she get that? We don't talk about him at home, but she had been at the swearing in, and she had kind of made a little spectacle of herself at the swearing in, walking back and forth behind him on the stage, which he didn't really mind. He said, "We're a family oriented group here." Well, some reason she wanted to do that, and of course, my wife said, "Oh, don't worry about it. She'll be asleep by the time we get to the orchard," and she was. And so I turned the ignition key off, and from the back seat from Sophia comes the words, "Dad, I want to pick apples for Colin Powell." So I said, "Let's go pick apples." So we pick apples for Colin Powell. We get a bag. Next morning, I bring them into Helen. I say, "Helen, just doing what dads do here. I'm just delivering these apples because my daughter told her the little story. She says that'll be fine." That night, and I always worked late. My door was about 5 or 6 away from Secretary Powell's. He had a large office. I had a smaller office, and John Beecroft, who was one of his assistants, showed up in my door frame with an envelope, and on this envelope was my daughter's name in large letters. And so that weekend, I opened it with my daughter together, and in large letters, Colin Powell had written, "Dear Sophia, thank you so much for these apples. I love apples. Your friend, Colin Powell." And here's the point, Melissa. If he did that once, he did it 10,000 times. He cared about people. Our best leaders, from our founding fathers, George Washington, all the way forward through Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt and Harry Truman, everybody, our best leaders are the leaders that care about people first, because it's what animates them, just like a soldier, just like a sailor. It is, if you are thinking in an other regarding way, everything about your life is aligned with that compass needle. And now you do things every day on instinct, and Reagan did them on instinct to make the world a better place. And I'll give you one other story. One day I had about probably 2,000 people working for me, between contractors and other people, and I had a big operation, and the State Department, like the intelligence community, is spread out all over Washington, D.C. And a woman showed up in my office. I had asked someone from Navy Hill, which is a faraway building, not the main state building. I had asked if she would come over and brief me on something. And so I can't remember whether her name was Marianne or it was. And anyway, she came through the front door of my office, and one of many, 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 many people that worked with me. And she looked a little bemused. She looked a little mystified. And I said, "Everything okay?" And she said, yes. She said, when Secretary Powell first got here, he walked through the main state building and shook every hand. And then he went to the outbuildings over to Navy Hill and these other buildings around the city. And it took a couple of days because there are thousands of people out there. And we would pour out of the hall. Rumors pass fast that the Secretary of State is here in our hallway, in our building. He's shaking hands, and so people would pour out of their offices. And of course, what was Secretary Powell building? He was telling everybody they mattered, and he was building loyalty by saying, "You matter enough to me that I'm going to come meet you, shake your hand." And she said, what he would do is he would say, "So tell me your name, tell me what you're working on, do you have any kids?" And she said he did that for days until he had met everybody. And she said, "I haven't seen him for 2 years." I walked in the front of the building underneath all those big flags, and he said he was leaving the building, and he stopped. He looked at me and he said, "Marianne, how are you doing? And how are those three kids?" She said, "How? How did he do that?" I said, "I don't know. You don't get to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs by chance." Um, he had an incredible memory for people. He was incredibly inclusive. And a black man in the 50s and 60s probably had to learn that lesson the hard way. And he took nothing personally, as Ronald Reagan, a very important character trait that they both shared. No matter what bad thing got said about them, they never took it personally. I watched day after day as bad things came over the gunnels, and in particular from Don Rumsfeld, and Powell would just say, I mean, literally, for all the years, never did I hear him say a bad word about Don Rumsfeld. He would say, "Well, I think my friend Don's just having a bad day. Let's see if we can find whatever." Or he'd say, "I think my friend Don is looking for such and such." And so what happens is you pass a lesson forward. And of course, Powell in part probably learned that lesson from Reagan. If you do not take things personally, then the people beneath you, in order to hold themselves to your standard, don't take things personally. If you're not going to get upset about it, it would be a petty thing for me to get upset about it if the boss isn't going to get upset about it. So he taught that lesson very profoundly. The idea that to be a real professional, to be someone who really is doing your job the way that the American people, if you're in public service, want you to do it, it cannot be about you. It can never be about you. It has to be about the larger mission. And of course, that's a military principle, but it's also a civilian principle. It's also the principle that animates us as parents, right? It cannot, at a certain point in life, it's no longer about you. Um, Powell personified that. He also was inclusive in a way. I'll tell you a funny story. We were flying to Mexico, and we'd fly on his plane, and we were going to meet for the first time. I'd only been there 2 months, and I get a call that his secretary says, "I want you to go with me. We're going to talk law enforcement issues, rule of law, counter narcotics. We're going to be meeting with." I don't think we met with the president at that time, but we were meeting with the foreign minister, the attorney general. So the way it worked that morning of the big meeting was we uh we we're in a big room with a horseshoe type table, massive table, big room, and the Mexicans have all their people there, and we Americans, there might have been 6 or 7 of us there. And the way it worked is that the leader of the delegation on the Mexican side, on the American side, would introduce their people. So Colin Powell, it gets to Colin Powell's moment to introduce his people, and so he goes around, and when he gets to me, and I've only been there 2 months, he gets to me and he says to the whole group, "And this is my assistant secretary, Bobby Ray Charles." And I just didn't do anything. I said, "Yep." And afterwards, I went up to him and I said, "Sir, I I'm just new to this, and I don't mean it probably doesn't matter, but I thought I would just mention, just in case it mattered, that probably doesn't. My middle name actually isn't Ray." And he puts his arm around me and says, "Bobby, I know that." And so, Reagan taught with incredible um, inner happiness, happy warrior. And he passed on the happy warrior thinking to Colin Powell. And Ronald Reagan himself was such a funny, cheerful person. A lot of his humor was spontaneous, just like Powell's. Um, and I guess I put it this way. I would tell my staff at times, I want you to try to come to work every day inspired. I really do, because it's a great privilege for us to have these jobs. No matter what level you're at, it's a great privilege. But there are going to be days when you cannot be inspired for whatever reason. And on those days, something's happening and it's coming apart at the seams. I want you at least to maintain the ability to be amused. So if you can't be inspired, at least be amused. And you know what? It changes your whole day. It makes your whole day a happy day.
I absolutely love that. I am going to use that. I think that's a really great way to end this conversation. So I want to just remind anyone watching this again, Cherish America is the book. You can buy it anywhere. But if you buy it through us at reaganfoundation.org/store, you will get a signed copy, signed directly from Bobby. So thank you for that. And although we heard a lot of the stories, we just really brushed the surface of all the great stories you tell. So I highly recommend to anyone watching this to go get a copy. And Bobby, thank you for your time. Thank you for writing this book, and thank you for spending an afternoon with us.
It's been a great privilege to talk with you, as it was a great privilege to work with President and Mrs. Reagan. And we all have blessings in our lives. And maybe one of the things out of this book is everybody feels a little more grateful at the end.
As well said. So thank you.
Thank
you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for today's virtual programming event. We hope this conversation has inspired you to share what you've learned with your family and friends, and that you'll join us again for an upcoming event.
And let me offer lesson number 1 about America. All great change in America begins at the dinner table. So tomorrow night in the kitchen, I hope the talking begins. And children, if your parents haven't been teaching you what it means to be an American, let them know and nail them on it. That would be a very American thing to do.